Ken always liked to talk big. He'd say things like, "Nothing would ever happen to you while I'm around," or "I'd protect you no matter what." I believed him because when you love someone you tend to believe the version of them they sell you. I never imagined I'd be replaying those words in my head on the worst night of my life. It happened just after midnight. I was asleep when I heard the sound, soft at first like metal brushing against metal. First I thought it was the wind. Then I heard it again, louder, intentional. My heart started pounding before my brain could even catch up. I nudged Ken awake. "Did you hear that?" He sat up, confused, eyes heavy with sleep. Before he could answer, the sound came again, this time unmistakable. Someone was inside our house. Everything after that happened too fast. Ken jumped out of bed, not toward the door like I expected, but away from it. He rushed into the hallway, darted into the bathroom, and slammed the door shut. I heard the lock click. Froze. For a moment I thought maybe he was grabbing something. Phone. A weapon. Anything. But then he yelled through the door, his voice shaking. "Stay quiet." That's when it hit me. He wasn't coming back. Before I could move, the bedroom door creaked open. A man stepped inside, his face partially covered, his hand gripping a gun. The room felt smaller instantly, like the walls were closing in on me. "Don't scream," he said calmly, pointing the weapon straight at me. "Do exactly what I say." I nodded, barely able to breathe. He didn't rush. That was the scariest part. He took his time, scanning the room, opening drawers, grabbing my jewelry box, emptying our emergency cash from the nightstand. I stood there, shaking, trying not to cry, trying not to think about the locked bathroom 10 feet away. The whole time I kept hoping, praying that Ken would burst through the door, that he'd do something. Anything. He never did. When the intruder finally left, the house went eerily quiet. Minutes passed. Then I heard Ken's voice from behind the door. "Is he gone?" I stared at the bathroom door in disbelief. "Yes," I said flatly. Ken came out slowly, looking pale and embarrassed. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived quickly, asking questions, checking the house. They wanted to know if we recognized the man, if either of us was hurt. We answered no. When they asked Ken what happened, he hesitated. I ended up telling the story myself. I noticed the looks the officers exchanged. Subtle but unmistakable. The kind that said everything without saying anything at all. After they left, Ken suggested installing security cameras, like that would somehow undo what had already happened. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling while Ken snored beside me, completely at ease. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment he ran. I wondered what would have happened if the intruder hadn't just wanted valuables. I wondered if Ken would have done anything at all if I'd been hurt. The next morning I made breakfast in silence. When Ken came downstairs, he knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," I said. He sighed. "If this is about last night, I can explain." I listened as he talked about adrenaline, fight-or-flight instincts, and how fear took over. He said his body just reacted. That he didn't mean to leave me alone. I understood the science behind what he was saying, but emotionally, it didn't change how abandoned I felt. I accepted his apology. On the surface, things went back to normal. But deep down, something had shifted. And as much as I tried to ignore it, a quiet voice inside me kept whispering the same question. What if this wasn't the first time he chose himself over me? I told myself the break-in was a one-time failure, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized. This wasn't the first moment Ken didn't protect me. And soon, I'd remember exactly when it started. Once the shock of the break-in faded, I tried convincing myself it was an isolated incident. People react differently under pressure, right? Fear does strange things. That's what I kept telling myself every time the image replayed in my head. Ken sprinting away while I stood frozen in our bedroom. But the more I thought about it, the harder it became to ignore a nagging truth. This wasn't new behavior. A memory surfaced that I hadn't revisited in years. One I'd brushed off back when everything between Ken and me was still fresh and exciting. Before Ken, I had a messy breakup with a man who refused to let go. Blocking him wasn't enough. He'd make new accounts, stalk my stories, and show up wherever he thought I'd be. It was exhausting and unsettling, but at the time I thought it was just something I had to deal with on my own. One night early in my relationship with Ken, we went out to dinner. I posted a harmless photo of my meal, not thinking anything of it. Somehow my ex saw it. Halfway through dinner he appeared. He walked straight up to our table like he belonged there. He started pleading, then yelling. He insulted me, insulted Ken, and accused me of throwing my life away. People stared. My hands shook. I waited for Ken to stand up, to say something, to shut it down. He didn't. Ken just sat there, eyes wide, shrinking into his chair like he wanted to disappear. The person who finally stepped in wasn't my boyfriend. It was our waiter, who called the police and had my ex escorted out. I ended up filing for a restraining order days later. Ken didn't come with me. Didn't offer. Didn't ask. At the time I excused it. We were still new. He didn't know the full story. I told myself it wasn't fair to judge him so early. But now, after the break-in, that memory felt different. He hadn't frozen because he didn't understand the situation. He froze because that's who he was under pressure. Then came the smaller moments. The ones that seemed insignificant on their own but started stacking up. A few days after the robbery, Ken and I went to the movies. As we walked toward the theater, a guy bumped into me hard enough to knock the popcorn out of my hands. The bucket flipped, kernels scattering everywhere. The guy didn't apologize. He just glanced back and kept walking. I waited for Ken to say something. Anything. He didn't. Instead, he tugged my arm gently and said, "Let's just go in before the movie starts." I sat through the film annoyed, distracted, and snackless. It wasn't about the popcorn. It was about how invisible I felt standing next to him. Not long after, it was my mom's birthday. The whole family gathered at my parents' house, including my sister Tabitha. Growing up, we were inseparable. Even now, every time we see each other, it feels like no time has passed. I pulled her aside into her old bedroom and told her everything. The break-in, the movie incident, the lingering unease I couldn't shake. Her eyes widened. "Girl, your life sounds like a drama series," she said, trying to lighten the mood. Then she got serious. She told me she thought Ken was probably just scared, that fear didn't always mean bad intentions. She suggested I give him grace. I wanted that comfort. I wanted her to be right. But instead of feeling reassured, I felt worse. On the drive home, I realized something unsettling. I had started avoiding situations where Ken and I were alone in public. Dinner dates felt risky. Late outings made me anxious. I kept wondering if something happened. Would he run again? That night, I texted my best friend and asked her to meet for brunch the next day. I needed another perspective. Someone who knew me well but wasn't emotionally tied to the situation. When we sat down, she listened quietly as I told her everything. She looked genuinely shocked. "We always called you Barbie and Ken," she said. "You two seemed perfect." Then she told me a story that made my stomach drop. Early in her relationship, her boyfriend Brock had saved her life. Literally. She'd almost stepped into traffic while distracted, and Brock had shoved her out of the way just in time, nearly getting hit himself. I smiled and nodded while she talked. But inside something broke. Because while her partner ran toward danger, mine had been running away from it for years. And for the first time, I wondered if love was enough when safety was missing. I thought maybe I was being unfair. Until one night at dinner, when a stranger's argument turned violent, and Ken showed me exactly who he was when things got real again. Ken noticed the distance between us before I said anything out loud. I wasn't as affectionate. I hesitated before making plans. I kept scanning rooms the way people do after something traumatic, except the fear wasn't just of strangers anymore. It was of being alone when I shouldn't be. A week after brunch with my best friend, Ken suggested we go out to dinner. "I want to make things right," he said. "I know I've messed up." Part of me appreciated the effort. Another part of me wondered if an apology dinner could really fix what felt fundamentally broken. Still, I agreed. The restaurant was busy, warm, filled with laughter and clinking glasses. For a moment I let myself relax. Maybe I had been overthinking everything. Maybe I was letting fear write a story that wasn't entirely true. Then it happened. A couple seated a few tables away started arguing. At first it was hushed, sharp whispers, tense body language. Then the man's voice rose. He complained about money, about feeling unappreciated, about how nothing he did was ever good enough. The woman snapped back. She accused him of cheating, of lying, of treating her like she was disposable. People started to stare. My chest tightened. I glanced at Ken, expecting him to notice, to be alert. Instead, he stared at his plate like he hoped the situation would dissolve on its own. Then the man stood up. Before anyone could react, he slapped the woman so hard she fell sideways out of her chair. The sound echoed through the restaurant. Gasps filled the air. Everything seemed to slow down. Two men from nearby tables jumped up immediately. Someone shouted for the manager. A woman screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor. Turned to Ken. His face had drained of color. His eyes darted toward the exit. He slid lower in his seat, shoulders hunched, breathing fast. For half a second I thought he was about to stand up and help. Instead he bolted. Not toward the couple. Not toward me. Toward the back of the restaurant. I sat there frozen, humiliation and clarity crashing into me at the same time. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't shock. This was a pattern. When things got dangerous, Ken disappeared. Once the situation was under control and the police were called, I left money on the table and stormed outside. Ken caught up to me near the car, rambling about how he didn't want to get involved, how things like that could escalate. I didn't respond. On the drive home, my mind replayed every moment I had ignored. The home invasion, my ex at the restaurant, the spilled popcorn, and now this. I realized something painful. I had spent years making excuses for a man who showed me exactly who he was every time it mattered. The next day we took our dog She to the dog park. It was supposed to be relaxing, sunny weather, fresh air, a simple reset. She was tiny, fearless, darting around the bigger dogs like she owned the place. Ken and I sat on a bench watching her play. That's when a massive Rottweiler wandered over. At first it just stared at She. Then it barked, loud, aggressive. She yelped and ran straight toward me, leaping into my lap. The Rottweiler followed, barking inches from my face. Panic. Before I could stand, Ken moved, but not forward. He stepped behind me, using me as a shield. My heart pounded as I held She tightly. Just as the dog lunged closer, its owner whistled and called it back. The Rottweiler turned and ran off like nothing had happened. The owner apologized casually, explaining that his dog was still being trained. I couldn't even respond. As soon as the man walked away, I turned to Ken, shaking. "What was that?" he asked. He looked genuinely confused. "What do you mean? Why didn't you help me?" He shrugged. "It could have bitten me." The words hit harder than I expected. "What about me?" he asked. He sighed, annoyed. I couldn't protect both of us. Someone had to be able to call for help. I felt my blood boil. He wasn't even ashamed. In his mind, he had done the logical thing. In that moment, any doubt I still had vanished. I couldn't trust him. Not in danger, not in chaos, not even in something as small as a barking dog. And as I held She close, I knew I was running out of excuses. I finally admitted the truth to myself at the dog park. But it wasn't until I talked to my mom the next day that I realized exactly what kind of love I had been settling for, and what I truly deserved. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual. I barely noticed the roads or the music playing softly in the background. My mind was stuck on one question that refused to leave me alone. Can you love someone you don't feel safe with? When I pulled into the driveway, I already knew why I was there. I needed clarity. Real clarity, not excuses or half-comforting explanations. As soon as I walked inside, my mom looked at me and sighed like she'd been expecting this moment. "Is this about Ken?" she asked gently. He nodded. We sat at the kitchen table, The same one where she'd given me advice my entire life. I told her everything again, but this time I didn't soften it. I talked about the break-in, the restaurant incident, my ex, the dog park. I admitted the part I'd been avoiding, that I didn't trust my partner to protect me, even in small moments. When I finished, my mom didn't rush to speak. She just listened. Then she said something that hit me straight in the chest. "The thing I loved most about your father," she said, "was how safe he made me feel." She talked about how my dad wasn't aggressive or reckless, but he was present. He paid attention. He stepped in when things went wrong. Not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he cared more about his family than his own fear. She reached for my hand. "Love isn't just about laughter and companionship," she continued. "Feeling protected matters. Feeling secure matters. If you're constantly wondering what your partner would do in an emergency, that's not peace." I asked her how I was supposed to know whether to stay or leave. She gave me a sad smile. "That depends on the kind of man you want to build a life with." I didn't need her to say anything else. The answer had been forming in my chest for weeks, tightening every time Ken chose himself over me. I felt tears spill over as the reality settled in. I wanted what my parents had. And Ken wasn't it. My mom hugged me long and tight, like she knew I was grieving something that wasn't dead yet, but needed to be. When I pulled away, I felt strangely calm. The decision hurt, but it felt right. When I got home, Ken was in the living room watching TV. He smiled when he saw me, completely unaware that everything was about to change. "We need to talk," I said. He muted the TV immediately, his smile fading. I sat across from him, my hands shaking despite my resolve. I started carefully, telling him how much our relationship meant to me, how we had built a life together, how he had been my best friend. I watched his posture relax, until I said the words I'd been holding back. "But I don't feel safe with you." The room went silent. I told him everything again, but this time I didn't minimize it. I listed every moment he had stepped back when I needed him to step up. Even the small things. Especially the small things. He tried to interrupt, but I kept going. When it was his turn, he repeated the same explanations I'd heard before. Instincts, fear, survival. He said he could change, that he'd try harder, that he just needed time. I shook my head. "I don't want to change you," I said quietly. "I just can't build a future feeling like this." That's when I told him I was leaving. He begged. He reminded me of our history, our plans, our memories. And for a moment I almost gave in, because walking away from years of love is harder than people admit. But I knew staying would mean betraying myself. Packed that night. The next morning something unexpected happened. Felt lighter. Sad, yes, but free. I realized I had stayed not because I felt secure, but because I was afraid of starting over. And that wasn't a good enough reason to stay. Leaving Ken felt like the end of everything, but a few years later when I met someone new, I finally understood what safety, courage, and real partnership actually looked like. And why I had to learn that lesson the hard way. For a while after leaving Ken, I moved back in with my parents. First, it felt like a step backward. I was an adult woman sleeping in my childhood room, surrounded by old trophies and faded posters. But slowly, that space became a place of healing. Without the constant anxiety, my body relaxed in ways I hadn't noticed it tensing before. I slept through the night. I stopped replaying worst-case scenarios in my head. I wasn't bracing myself every time I went out in public. The silence was peaceful. Friends would ask if I missed Ken, and the truth was complicated. I missed the familiarity. I missed the history. But I didn't miss the fear. And that told me everything I needed to know. A few years later, when I wasn't looking for anything serious, I met Brad. He wasn't flashy. He didn't talk big. He didn't brag about what he'd do if something ever happened. He was just steady, confident in a quiet way. First, I kept my guard up. Trauma has a way of doing that. I watched him closely, almost subconsciously, waiting to see how he reacted to discomfort or conflict. The first time I noticed the difference was something small. We were walking downtown one evening when a man stumbled toward us, clearly drunk and yelling at no one in particular. Before I even processed what was happening, Brad subtly stepped in front of me. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough to put himself between me and the chaos. Nothing happened. The man walked past. But my chest tightened, not from fear, from recognition. Brad didn't even mention it afterward. He didn't need credit. To him it was automatic. Over time there were more moments. When my car broke down late at night, he stayed on the phone with me the entire time and drove across town to make sure I wasn't alone. When someone raised their voice at me in public, he calmly intervened without escalating the situation. He paid attention. He showed up. And most importantly, he never made me feel like protecting me was an inconvenience. That's when it hit me. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's consistent. As our relationship deepened, I realized how much I had normalized before. I thought love was about compromise, about understanding flaws. But I had compromised something essential, my sense of safety. Brad made me feel secure without ever making me feel small. Strong without being reckless. Protective without being controlling. One night we talked about past relationships. I told him about Ken. About the break-in. The restaurant. The dog park. He listened quietly. When I finished, he didn't insult Ken or call him weak. He just said, "I'm sorry you went through that. You deserved better." And for the first time I fully believed it. Being with Brad didn't erase the past, but it gave it meaning. I finally understood why things had ended the way they did. If I had stayed with Ken, I would have never known what it felt like to be truly at ease with someone. It was bittersweet, realizing how long I had settled, but grateful I didn't settle forever. Love, I learned, isn't just about chemistry or shared memories. It's about trust, reliability, knowing that when things go wrong you're not facing them alone. I thought the story ended there, but years later, something unexpected happened that forced me to look back at Ken one last time, and finally understand why everything unfolded exactly the way it did. Life has a strange way of circling back when you least expect it. Years had passed since I left Ken. I had built a new rhythm, new routines, new memories, and a sense of peace I once thought was impossible. Brad and I had settled into a relationship that felt safe and solid, the kind of love that didn't make my heart race with anxiety but steadied it instead. I rarely thought about Ken anymore, so when his name popped up on my phone one afternoon, it caught me completely off guard. First, I didn't respond. I stared at the screen, debating whether reopening that chapter was worth it. Curiosity won. His message was simple. "Hey, I heard you're doing well. I just wanted to talk if that's okay." We met for coffee a few days later in a quiet cafe. Seeing him again felt surreal, like running into someone from a different lifetime. He looked older, more tired, less certain of himself. After some small talk, he finally said what I think he'd been holding on to for years. "I should have protected you," he admitted. "I didn't realize how much my fear controlled me until you left." He told me about therapy, about how losing me forced him to confront parts of himself he'd always avoided. He said he finally understood that his instincts weren't just about fear, they were about avoidance. Listening to him, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness. For the first time I saw Ken clearly, not as the man I hoped he would be, but as the man he actually was back then. And I realized something important. His growth didn't change the past, but it validated my decision. I thanked him for the apology, and I meant it. When we parted ways, there was no lingering ache. No what if. Just closure. On the drive home I thought about how far I'd come. How many moments I'd spent questioning my instincts instead of trusting them. Leaving Ken had been painful, but staying would have been worse. That night, Brad asked how the meeting went. I told him the truth, that it gave me closure, not doubt. He smiled, pulled me into a hug and said, "I'm glad you found what you needed." And I had. Looking back, I realized the lesson wasn't about bravery in dramatic moments. It was about consistency. About choosing a partner whose actions align with their words, especially when things get uncomfortable. Ken taught me what I didn't want. Brad showed me what I deserved. And most importantly, I learned to listen to myself. Because love without safety isn't love. It's endurance. And I was done enduring.